Good evening, I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. Although colonists both north and south were bound together by a common language and a common allegiance to Mother England, they established different patterns of settlement, different economies, different political systems, and even different sets of values, defining distinctive regional characteristics that would persist for generations. The promise of riches, especially from golden-leaved tobacco, drew the first settlers to the southern colonies. But to the north, in the fertile valleys of the Middle Atlantic region and especially along the rocky shores of New England, it was not worldly wealth but religious devotion that principally shaped the earliest settlements. Tonight, Rebecca McMurran starts off our show with an exploration into the Protestant Reformation, and the events that set in motion the fundamental religious beliefs that would come to represent the northern colonies during their early settlement.
Little did the German friar, Martin Luther, realize, when he nailed his protests against Catholic doctrines to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517, that he was shaping the destiny of a yet unknown nation. Denouncing the authority of priests and popes, Luther declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's word. He ignited a fire of religious reform, known as the Protestant Reformation. It licked its way across Europe for more than a century, dividing peoples, toppling sovereigns, and kindling the spiritual fervor of millions of men and women, some of whom helped to found America. The reforming flame burned especially bright in the heart of John Calvin of Geneva. This somber and severe religious leader elaborated on Martin Luther's ideas in ways that would profoundly affect the thought and character of countless generations of future Americans. Calvinism became the dominant theological credo, not only of the New England Puritans, but of other American settlers as well, including the Scottish Presbyterians, French Huguenots, and communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church. Calvin spelled out his basic doctrine in a learned Latin tome of 1536, entitled Institutes of the Christian Religion. God, Calvin argued, was all-powerful, and all-good. Humans, because of the corrupting effect of original sin, were weak and wicked. God was also all-knowing, and he knew who was going to heaven, and who was going to hell. Since the first moment of creation, some souls, the elect, had been destined for eternal bliss and others for eternal torment. Good works could not save those whom predestination had marked for the infernal fires, but neither could the elect count on their predetermined salvation, and lead lives of wild immoral abandon. For one thing, no one could be certain of his or her status in the heavenly ledger. Gnawing doubts about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. They constantly sought, in themselves, and others, signs of conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace. Conversion was thought to be an intense, identifiable personal experience in which God revealed to the elect their heavenly destiny. Thereafter, they were expected to lead sanctified lives, demonstrating by their holy behavior that they were among the visible saints. These doctrines swept into England just as King Henry VIII was breaking his ties with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, making himself the head of the Church of England. Henry would have been content to retain Roman rituals and creeds, but his action powerfully stimulated some English religious reformers to undertake a total purification of English Christianity. Many of these Puritans, as it happened, came from the commercially depressed woolen districts. Calvinism, with its message of stark but reassuring order in the divine plan, fed on this social unrest and provided spiritual comfort to the economically disadvantaged. As time went on, Puritans grew increasingly unhappy over the snail-like progress of the Protestant Reformation in England. They burned with pious zeal to see the Church of England wholly decatholicized. The most devout Puritans, including those who eventually settled New England, believed that only visible saints, that is, persons who felt the stirrings of grace in their souls and could demonstrate its presence to their fellow Puritans, should be admitted to church membership. But the Church of England enrolled all the king's subjects, which meant that the saints had to share pews and communion rails with the damned. Appalled by this unholy fraternizing, a tiny group of dedicated Puritans, known as separatists, vowed to break away entirely from the Church of England. King James I, a shrewd Scotsman, was head of both the state and the Church in England from 1603 to 1625. He quickly perceived that if his subjects could defy him as their spiritual leader, they might one day defy him as their political leader. In fact, they would later defy and behead his son, Charles I. To forestall this eventuality, he began to threaten and harass the more bothersome separatists out of the land. For the Historytellers, I'm Rebecca McMurran.
The most famous congregation of separatists, fleeing royal wrath, departed for Holland in 1608. During the ensuing 12 years of toil and poverty, they were increasingly distressed by the Dutchification of their children. They longed to find a haven where they could live, and die as Englishmen, and as purified Protestants. America was the logical refuge, despite the early ordeals of Jamestown, and despite tales of New World cannibals roasting steaks from their white victims over open fires. A group of the separatists in Holland, after negotiating with the Virginia Company, at length secured rights to settle under its jurisdiction. But their crowded Mayflower, 65 days at sea, missed its destination and arrived off the stony coast of New England in 1620, with a total of 102 persons. One had died en route, an unusually short casualty list, and one had been born, and appropriately named Oceanus. Fewer than half of the entire party were separatists. Prominent among the group was a peppery and stocky soldier of fortune, Captain Miles Standish, dubbed by one of his critics Captain Shrim. He later rendered indispensable service as an Indian fighter and negotiator. The Pilgrims did not make their initial landing at Plymouth Rock, as commonly supposed, but undertook a number of preliminary surveys. They finally chose for their site the shore of inhospitable Plymouth Bay. This area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, and consequently the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. Before disembarking, the Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed the brief Mayflower Compact. Although setting an invaluable precedent for later written constitutions, this document was not a constitution at all. It was a simple agreement to form a crude government and to submit to the will of the majority under the regulations agreed upon. The compact was signed by 41 adult males, 11 of them with the exalted rank of Mr., though not by the servants, and 2 seamen. The pact was a promising step toward genuine self-government, for soon the adult male settlers were assembling to make their own laws in open discussion town meetings, a great laboratory of liberty. The Pilgrims' first winter of 1620 and 1621 took a grisly toll. Only 44 out of the 102 survived. At one time only 7 were well enough to lay the dead in their frosty graves. Yet when the Mayflower sailed back to England in the spring, not a single one of the courageous band of separatists left. As one of them wrote, "It is not with us, as with other men, whom small things can discourage. God made his children prosperous," so the Pilgrims believed. The next autumn, that of 1621, brought bountiful harvests, and with them the first Thanksgiving Day in New England. In time the frail colony found sound economic progress in fur, fish, and lumber. The beaver and the Bible were the early mainstays, one for the sustenance of the body, the other for the sustenance of the soul. Plymouth proved that the English could maintain themselves in this uninviting region. The Pilgrims were extremely fortunate in their leaders. Prominent among them was the cultured William Bradford, a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was chosen governor 30 times in the annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear that independent, non-Puritan settlers on their particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the wilderness. Bustling fishing villages and other settlements did sprout to the north of Plymouth, on the storm-lashed shores of Massachusetts Bay, where many people were as much interested in codfish as they were in godliness. Quiet, and quaint, the little colony of Plymouth was never important economically or numerically. Its population numbered only 7,000 by 1691, when, still charterless, it merged with its giant neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the tiny settlement of Pilgrims was big, both morally and spiritually. Known as the Bay Colony Bible Commonwealth, the early Massachusetts colony was a haven for the purest of Puritans. Tonight, James Marshall reports on the founding and near-instant success of the Bay Colony Bible Commonwealth.
The separatist Pilgrims were dedicated extremists, the purest Puritans. More moderate Puritans sought to reform the Church of England from within. Though resented by bishops and monarchs, they slowly gathered support, especially in Parliament. But when Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and sanctioned the anti-Puritan persecutions of the reactionary Archbishop William Laud, many Puritans saw catastrophe in the making. In 1629 an energetic group of non-separatist Puritans, fearing for their faith and for England's future, secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. They proposed to establish a sizable settlement in the infertile Massachusetts area, with Boston soon becoming its hub. Stealing a march on both king and church, the newcomers brought their charter with them. For many years they used it as a kind of constitution, out of easy reach of royal authority. They steadfastly denied that they wanted to separate from the Church of England, only from its impurities. But back in England, the highly orthodox Archbishop Laud snorted that the Bay Colony Puritans were swine which rooted in God's vineyard. The Massachusetts Bay enterprise was singularly blessed. The well-equipped expedition of 1630, with 11 vessels carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants, started the colony off on a larger scale than any of the other English settlements. Continuing turmoil in England tossed up additional enriching waves of Puritans on the shores of Massachusetts in the following decade. During the Great Migration of the 1630s, about 70,000 refugees left England. But not all of them were Puritans, and only about 20,000 came to Massachusetts. Many were attracted to the warm and fertile West Indies, especially the sugar-rich island of Barbados. More Puritans came to this Caribbean islet than to all of Massachusetts. Many fairly prosperous, educated persons immigrated to the Bay Colony, including John Winthrop, a well-to-do pillar of English society, who became the colony's first governor. A successful attorney and manor lord in England, Winthrop eagerly accepted the offer to become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believing that he had a calling from God to lead the new religious experiment. He served as governor or deputy governor for 19 years. The resources and skills of talented settlers like Winthrop helped Massachusetts prosper, as fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding blossomed into important industries, especially fish and ships. Massachusetts Bay Colony rapidly shot to the fore as both the biggest and the most influential of the New England outposts. Massachusetts also benefited from a shared sense of purpose among most of the first settlers. "We shall be as a city upon a hill, a beacon to humanity," declared Governor Winthrop. The Puritan Bay colonists believed that they had a covenant with God, an agreement to build a holy society that would be a model for humankind. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
These common convictions deeply shaped the infant colony's life. Soon after the colonists' arrival, the franchise was extended to all freemen, adult males who belonged to the Puritan congregations, which in time came to be called collectively the Congregational Church. Unchurched men remained voteless in provincial elections, as did women. On this basis, about 2/5 of adult males enjoyed the franchise in provincial affairs, a far larger proportion than in contemporary England. Town governments, which conducted much important business, were even more inclusive. Their all-male property holders, and in some cases other residents as well, enjoyed the priceless boon of publicly discussing local issues, often with much heat, and of voting on them by a majority rule show of hands. Yet the provincial government, liberal by the standards of the time, was not a democracy. The able Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the Commons as the meaner sort and thought that democracy was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. "If the people be governors," asked one Puritan clergyman, "who shall be governed?" True, the freemen annually elected the governor and his assistants, as well as a representative assembly called the General Court. But only Puritans, the visible saints who alone were eligible for church membership, could be freemen. And according to the doctrine of the covenant, the whole purpose of government was to enforce God's laws, which applied to believers and non-believers alike. Moreover, non-believers as well as believers paid taxes for the government-supported church. Religious leaders thus wielded enormous influence in the Massachusetts Bible Commonwealth. They powerfully influenced admission to church membership by conducting public interrogations of persons claiming to have experienced conversion. Prominent among the early clergy was fiery John Cotton. Educated at England's Cambridge University, a Puritan citadel, he emigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. In the Bay Colony he devoted his considerable learning to defending the government's duty to enforce religious rules. Profoundly pious, he sometimes preached and prayed up to 6 hours in a single day. But the power of the preachers was not absolute. A congregation had the right to hire and fire its minister and to set his salary. Clergymen were also barred from holding formal political office. Puritans in England had suffered too much at the hands of a political Anglican clergy to permit in the New World another unholy union of religious and government power. In a limited way, the Bay colonists thus endorsed the idea of the separation of church and state. The Puritans were a worldly lot, despite, or even because of their spiritual intensity. Like John Winthrop, they believed in the doctrine of a calling to do God's work on earth. They shared in what was later called the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to work and to engagement in worldly pursuits. Legend to the contrary, they also enjoyed simple pleasures. They ate plentifully, drank heartily, sang songs occasionally, and made love monogamously. Like other peoples of their time in both America and Europe, they passed laws aimed at making sure these pleasures stayed simple by repressing certain human instincts. In New Haven, For example, a young married couple was fined 20 shillings for the crime of kissing in public, and in later years Connecticut came to be dubbed the Blue Law State. It was so named for the blue paper on which the repressive laws, also known as sumptuary laws, were printed. Yet life was serious business, and hellfire was real, a hell where sinners shriveled and shrieked in vain for divine mercy. An immensely popular poem in New England, selling one copy for every 20 people, was clergyman Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom. Especially horrifying were his descriptions of the fate of the damned. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror. But get away without delay, Christ pities not your cry, depart to hell, there may you yell, and roar eternally. Thank you for watching the first part in our series on settling the northern colonies. Stay tuned for our next episode where the Historytellers detail the continued religious growth and struggles of the Massachusetts Bay Colonies. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.